Story 1. My friend's fiancé was an underwater welder, diving so deep it was like being in total darkness. One day, he went down and never resurfaced. I can't remember if it was due to a rupture or a shock, but imagining him dying in such a dark, eerie place haunts me. Story 2. I saw something the other day about a woman who was doing research in the ocean and got dragged 300 feet underwater by a leopard seal that grabbed her by the foot. They resurfaced 10 minutes later. I believe it is the only recorded leopard seal attack resulting in death. Hopefully, she passed out quickly. That is just so terrifying to me. Story 3. Kyle McGarity was pushed down a manhole and was boiled alive over several hours. He had no broken bones or blunt force trauma, and steam doesn't kill nerve endings, so he felt the whole thing until it killed him. In response to some points raised, it took several hours before his body could be recovered due to the heat of the duct, but his death may not have taken hours. An earlier post mentions he was still alive when first responders showed up, and the cause of death was scalding, not shock, cardiac arrest, or suffocation. Either way, it was not quick. Story 4. Those Trinidadian divers that got sucked into that pipe they were working on. One of them was able to escape and go for help, but the company or government stalled the efforts, and the other two ended up suffocating a few days later in that dark, cold pipe underwater. Story 5. Standing on the edge of the 30,000-gallon tank of pig manure, getting overcome by the fumes, falling in and drowning. Happens every year. Not to the same person, clearly. Story 6. Hisashi Aoki was kept alive for 83 days after being exposed to radiation during a nuclear plant accident. He was the most radioactive man alive. Basically, his body just disintegrated slowly. Story 7. Most of the ones that really chill me have already been covered, but no one has yet mentioned Vladimir Komarov, the man who fell from space. First cosmonaut ever to go up twice. It became increasingly apparent during planning and training for his second mission, Soyuz 1, that it was terribly flawed at every level, but all official protests fell on deaf ears because of the bureaucratic culture of the program and the Kremlin. The whole thing had an air of doom, but he knew if he backed out, apart from all other consequences, his close friend and Soviet hero Yuri Gagarin would be compelled to take his place. The launch was a success, but after achieving orbit the solar sail failed to properly deploy, leaving several crucial systems unpowered and obscuring transmission from communications and navigation equipment. He wrestled with the craft trying to get it manually oriented for 5 hours and, through skillful piloting, partially succeeded, but failing thrusters and bad weather conditions caused mission control to cancel a companion launch that was intended to aid him and to abort his mission. He had to stay up orbiting Earth 18 times without proper guidance systems, acting as a human computer and gyroscope to get it into a proper re-entry window despite the unresponsive thrusters, but he eventually succeeded. He was in radio contact with Gagarin, assuring him conditions were good. It looked like he may actually make it. And then the primary chute failed to deploy. And then the secondary chute got tangled in the primary chute. Then the retro rockets failed to fire on ground approach, which would have been right before he hit the Earth at 90 miles per hour. Some reports have him transmitting screams of rage on the way down. In a similar vein, I was literally nauseous with horror when I first found out that the National Aeronautics and Space Administration covered up the fact that the Challenger accident wasn't immediately fatal and that several of the astronauts were very likely alive and conscious as their capsule rocketed off and then plunged into the sea. Story 8. The man who was hit by the woman driving drunk was lodged in her windshield but was still alive. She simply parked her car in the garage and went to bed. Story 9. I think it's a myotrophic lateral sclerosis, also known as motor neuron disease, a terminal illness which I sadly have. You slowly lose control over every muscle in your body, and you can't do anything for yourself. Eventually, you lose the ability to swallow and have to be fed through a tube. Then your lungs get too weak to breathe, and you have to be on a ventilator, all of this while your mind is unaffected, basically being locked in your own body. There is no cure or treatment. We don't know what causes it, and it can happen at any age. Story 10. When I lived in Florida, there was a rather large gopher tortoise near my riding stables. I went over to look at it, and it was making a terrible sound. Its shell was cracked, and there were red ants crawling in and out of its shell. They were attacking it while it was still alive on its most sensitive body parts. The sound the tortoise was making was a scream. I have never heard a tortoise scream in pain other than that one time. It was terrifying to see. I went inside, got a shovel, and swiftly ended its pain by cutting its head off. I sat there and cried because the thought of having to kill something to stop it from suffering was too much for my 17-year-old brain. Story 11. My mother drowned when her car was swept into floodwaters. She was seatbelt in and, due to infirmities, would not have been able to get herself out. I imagine her last moments were terrifying. It took almost 3 days to recover her body. Story 12. I have seen one where you slowly die over time. My father's Alzheimer's. I watched him turn into a shadow of himself from the brightest and kindest man I knew. Story 13. My great-grandfather was an early diver doing underwater construction and ship repairs in the Navy. He told me a story of a colleague who lost air pressure in his suit, and the external pressure basically squeezed his body up into the helmet. Story 14. Deborah Stevens. The woman was in her car while on the phone with 911, and she ended up drowning. The 911 operator told her to be quiet. The emergency call is awful to hear. Story 15. Sylvia Likens. 16-year-old girl who was raped and tortured in a basement by other kids and the woman who was taking care of her. Eventually, Sylvia died, and there are photos online showing her body carved with, "I'm a prostitute and proud." I cried when I saw it the first time. No one should ever go through something like that. Story 16. I'm a semi-retired oil geologist and certified master blaster. For the past 5 or so years, my teams and I have volunteered our time and talents in closing abandoned mines. Not just closing these death traps, but also doing rescues and recoveries. I close these death traps permanently with dynamite, composition 4, research department explosive pentaerythritol tetranitrate, and my special homebrew nitroglycerin. In the last 5 or so years, my teams and I have rescued over 120 people who thought it'd be a good idea to wander into these murder holes and see what great riches they could grab. Here's a newsflash for anyone entertaining the foolish desire to go into these dangerous killer holes. They are abandoned for a reason. The simple reason: there's nothing in there of any value. It's all been removed by the owners, and they walked away from a dangerous pit usually out in the middle of absolute nowhere. My teams and I have also recovered 173 bodies in the same time period. Abandoned mines are a Disneyland of death and dismemberment. Bad air, bad water, lethal molds, viruses from animal dens, attacks from the larger megafauna that have set up housekeeping in these holes in the ground, feet-thick layers of bat guano, hantavirus, rotted wood, false floors, complete darkness, pits, adits, tunnels, raises, and winzes that people march blindly into and find themselves falling for a few hundred feet. Over the last couple of months, I have rescued 3 family members, a mother and daughters, who thought mines were great for a family walkabout. I also recovered the 2 dead from the same family, a father and son, who blindly tumbled down into a shaft over 800 feet deep. More recently, I recovered a 12-year-old's body from a mine used by the local kids as a hangout. He had Down syndrome and had wandered away from his home over to the mine where he used to hang with his buddies. I recovered his body from under a pile of debris which he triggered, only to land on a ledge 300 feet below the main mine tunnel. The fall must have been terrifying, only to land at 32 feet per second squared on a narrow ledge of rocks that partially blocked the shaft. Unfortunately, the rocks he disturbed on the way down landed on him, crushing him to death. Plus, as a bonus, the rocks that fell to the bottom of the shaft hit old, stagnant water and caused clouds of noxious gases to evolve rapidly to fill the shaft. My team and I had to go full positive 4 containment suits to recover the poor lad. That mine no longer exists. DuPont Herculean 70% extra fast, a few kilos of composition 4, and a gallon of nitroglycerin closed that worthless pit for perpetuity. Unfortunately, there are thousands upon thousands of these potential murder holes left existing in all western United States. It's a job I'd gladly quit, but between people's greed and ignorance, I doubt I'll ever be out of work. Story 17. A kid in Ohio, I believe, got stuck upside down in the back of his car. He slowly suffocated, and the police even did a drive-by, but didn't detect anything and left. Story 18. As a nurse, I would much rather go through any one of these acutely terrible but relatively quick deaths than the protracted courses so many families will put a person through just because they cannot let go. Imagine spending weeks, months, or years sometimes as a body in a bed, unable to control your bowels or bladder, developing pressure wounds, with your brain and body no longer knowing each other. Sometimes you cannot breathe, and they will force you to by cutting a hole in your neck and putting in a tracheostomy. Sometimes you cannot swallow or eat, so they poke a hole into your stomach through your skin and put a tube in there so they can feed you liquid nutrition and crush your medications to put in there. Because we have gotten good at this, we can torture a body for a very long time until it finally gives out. It is so inhumane and undignified. Everyone who has decision-making power over another person should have to spend some time looking at what people go through. They need to understand that prolonging life is not the same as forcing someone to submit to a dragged-out death. Story 19. Back in the 1980s, a 16-year-old Japanese girl was kidnapped, threatened, raped, and then brutally murdered over the span of 40 days by the Yakuza. The details that were made public are sickening enough. James Bulger's death in Merseyside in the 1990s was another horrific murder. Story 20. My friend died out at sea, fell off a cruise in the middle of the night into the Arctic Ocean. I can only imagine how cold and scary that must have been in the pitch black. I still miss him to this day. Story 21. Lamar Bell, in 2015, was on the M9 near Stirling, Scotland. The car, driven by her boyfriend, crashed off the motorway. He died immediately, but she was left in the car for 3 days with serious injuries. The crash was reported to the police, but it was never logged, so no one went to investigate. She remained there until a passerby investigated and found her. She died 4 days later in the hospital, but could have survived if the police hadn't made a mistake. Story 22. In 2022, a guy I went to high school with got a new job at Caterpillar's foundry. It was his second week on the job, and he was tasked with taking a sample of the 2,600-degree molten iron. Safety procedures were not provided. There was literally no guardrail, and he fell into the crucible of molten iron. The coroner titled his death thermal annihilation. He literally disintegrated. That was the second death at that facility within 6 months. There was recently another death from a guy getting molten iron sprayed on him. For the guy I knew, Caterpillar was given a wrist slap fine of a mere $145,027 by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, despite their revenue being more than $50 billion in 2021. Story 23. In 2015, in Georgia, a 43-year-old man volunteering to help clean up after major flooding was killed by a tiger when entering a local warehouse. The flooding allowed animals to escape the local zoo. He died in the local hospital after being mauled. I can't imagine that moment of disbelief he had. Story 24. Byford Dolphin Accident. Divers were kept pressurized for weeks to avoid decompression sickness so they could descend to the ocean floor without having to spend days returning to the surface. They lived in a pressurized pod, and when they needed to dive, a diving bell was attached to the pod. It was pressurized, and the divers entered it before being sent to the floor. Upon their return, they entered their pod again. It was sealed, and the diving bell was depressurized. Because a safety device wasn't installed, workers accidentally left a 5-inch gap between the pod and the bell during depressurization. Due to this, when the bell was depressurized, the pod also depressurized, and the person standing near that gap was forced through it because of the high pressure. It was over in an instant for him, but looking at the pictures of the aftermath shows why it's so horrifying. He was turned into a slab of meat. Story 25. I heard a news story about a small child in Ohio, a baby, who was left alone for 10 days by her mother who went on a vacation. Oh, and Lacey Fletcher. Story 26. Retired firefighter here. The cause of death was a massive heart attack, but the discovery of the body was the horrific part. My engine company was sent to investigate a smell of gas in the area. The police department was already in the area, and they told us via radio that there was a strong odor in a residential area. We arrived on the block and, yes, there was definitely a strong odor. We used the sniffer and checked some of the gas meters nearby. Nothing, no hit on the meter. While searching around, a lady walked up to us and said she called 911 to report the odor. We walked over to her house and noticed the odor getting stronger as we approached her residence. I went into her backyard and was overpowered by the stench of rotting meat, like something cooked but then left out in the sun to rot. We looked over the fence into her neighbor's backyard and found the cause of the smell. Her neighbor, a portly man in his 60s, died while in his hot tub. She said she hadn't seen him for a few days. Well, he died and was stewed into a nice, thick, rich gravy while in the tub. Cooked right off the bone. Problem solved. Smell found. I was a vegetarian for the next 8 years. Story 27. Kelly and Bates. Her much older boyfriend groomed her and ended up isolating her from her family. He called the police one day to say he accidentally killed his girlfriend and she drowned. When the police arrived, she was dead in the tub, but she was covered in varying stages of healed bruises. I believe her knees were broken, and he had gouged her eyes out. It was determined by the medical examiner that the eyes were removed no less than 5 days before her death, but no more than 2 to 3 weeks. Either way, it happened while she was alive. On top of her eyes being gouged out, her eye sockets were also stabbed with a knife. Truly a horrific case.